Thanks all for coming along, and thank you very much to Andrew who's given up his time to delve into USS pensions. It is being recorded, and we will be sharing it with the wider membership afterwards.
Okay, thanks very much. We have just recently established a pensions working group at Sussex, consisting of myself, Jackie Grant, who's currently in Finland, and Sarah, to kind of educate ourselves on what's going on with the USS pension scheme, with a view to being able to lobby the Vice-Chancellor and the University Council in general. So people who are really interested in this stuff should contact us, and you'll be very welcome to join in this little incipient initiative, which so far exists in the form of a WhatsApp group. This is what we're going to do. I'm going to say something about the JEP, the Joint Expert Panel 1, the current valuation, the JEP 2 report, its dual discount proposal, a bit about the context, the Jane Hutton affair, the new chair of USS, and what has action so far, the action that we took both in spring 2018 and in November, December last year, what it has achieved, what's happening now, and why do we need more action. So, a quick reminder of JEP 1. I hope you don't mind these abbreviations. JEP 1, published in September 18, came up with 6 different recommendations. You'll see red crosses applied to 4 of them and ticks applied to the last 2, representing what, in the end, USS were willing to accept from these 6 recommendations. The first 2 recommendations, without going into too much detail, were ways of mitigating the effects of Test 1, which, to cut a long story short, is a test which USS introduced in 2014, which has the effect of progressively de-risking the scheme, i.e. moving its assets more and more into bonds and bond-like instruments, thereby reducing the rate of return on the scheme's assets and forcing us to pay more in contributions. So these 2 were ways of mitigating the effects of Test 1. And then there were other recommendations as well, which, if all 6 had been applied to the 2017 valuation, would have led to a deficit of £4 billion and to members paying 9.1% and employers 20.1%. So somewhat above, well, definitely above the current rates, which were at that time 8% for members and 18% for employers. Subsequently, USS released figures, although they never released them publicly, but they released them to the JNC, which showed that if all 6 of the recommendations had been applied to the 2018 valuation, which, as we know, replaced the 2017 valuation, then the result would have been a surplus of £0.6 billion and members' contributions of 7.8% and employers of 17.7%. What we've ended up with is option 3 of the 3 options for the 2018 valuation, which has given us 21.1% for employers and 9.6% for members. So that's where we're currently at. There was a kind of intermediary step where, because of the deadlock, USS imposed a settlement arising from the 2017 valuation, which was going to go up in steps, increasing our pension contributions step by step. But that was superseded after the first step, which took place in April 2019. That was superseded by the introduction of option 3 basically through it being forced through the JNC in August 2019 and then implemented in October 2019. So that's the regime under which we're currently living, 9.6% for members and 21.1% for employers. And then Option 3 also specifies that unless the 2020 valuation has produced a new settlement, which is agreed by the JNC, then these figures will automatically go up to 23.7% and 11%. The pensions regulator commented on option 3 in August 2019, at the time that it was being pushed through the JNC. The approach for the 2018 valuation's technical provisions under both option 1 and option 3 is broadly consistent with that used for the 2017 valuation, and as such it remains at the limit of what we consider to be compliant with legislative requirements for prudence. So the 2004 Pensions Act sets out the broad framework for valuing pensions, and then the 2005 regulations tell pension schemes how they have to operate that framework. And essentially what they have to do is to value the assets every 3 years and then value the liabilities. And the way they value the liabilities is by applying a discount rate to each of those liabilities, which is obviously a sum of money that's got to be paid to a pensioner at some time in the future, applying a discount rate backward to the present so as to get a value that would be equivalent to the liability. And in order to do that, they have to choose a discount rate which is prudent. That's about all the regulations say. It doesn't say much more. It says it's got to be prudently chosen discount rate. And then, of course, if the value of the liabilities, which is called the technical provisions, exceeds the value of the present assets of the fund, then we have a deficit. If the value of the liabilities is less than the present assets, then we have a surplus. Sussex responded to the JEP1 report in its council meeting of March 2019. The University of Sussex is disappointed that the recommendations of the Joint Expert Panel were not acceptable to USS. So this was a response actually not just to the JEP1 report, but to what USS did with it, which was essentially to gut it of most of the things which would have brought down the level of contributions. UUK, Adam Tickell, speaking as a spokesperson for UUK in July 2019, took a somewhat different view, but Professor Tickell, who disagreed with the union's interpretation of how the review's recommendation should be applied, said the proposal supported by the employers substantially meets the recommendations of the independent Joint Expert Panel. So why do we make this contrast? Why do I make this contrast? Well, I think because it does seem as if UUK and our Vice-Chancellor, speaking as a representative of UUK, essentially reconciled themselves to the paring down of the Joint Expert Panel's recommendations, despite the fact that University of Sussex Council had expressed disappointment that there had been so much paring down. Now we move forward to the second JEP report, JEP2, December the 13th, 2019, I guess an odd day to release it, immediately after the election, but there it is. Here are a few things that they said. Our conclusions and recommendations should be considered as a package, which taken together can provide a way for the interested parties to work together to secure the future of the scheme and a more holistic approach to the problems that arise. So they took, the Joint Expert Panel's first report was really meant to be providing the basis for an interim solution to the issue of how much we should be paying in contributions, which could give us breathing space in which to think more seriously about the whole methodology of valuation of USS. That breathing space, as I say, was really not implemented in the way that the JEP1 report wished or suggested, but nevertheless the JEP2 report has gone on to address the issue of the methodology of valuation for the future and also the whole issue of the governance of USS. And they've been very ambitious. They say their conclusions and recommendations are a package. Everything kind of fits together into a whole. They haven't limited themselves to a few platitudes. The panel has serious concerns that without a clear commitment to action, the scheme will end up in the same place again. So clearly, the JEP are intimating that they don't want the same thing to happen to the second report as happened to the first, that essentially, in large part, it was disregarded by USS. The panel believes that a failure to take forward the recommendations in this report would mark a failure for members, employers, and the sector. The panel wishes to propose that all of the interested parties commit to a roadmap, and that the three key areas that should be addressed are governance, including the role of the JNC, the 2020 valuation and beyond, and the long-term strategy of the scheme. So you can see that they have been ambitious in really trying to take the entire scheme by the scruff of the neck and propose a new way of governing the scheme, a new way of valuing the scheme's liabilities, and a new long-term strategy for the scheme. So they've really stepped up, I think, in this report. What do they have to say on these different issues? On JET 1, the failure to collectively go forward with these recommendations, namely JET 1, was, in the panel's view, a missed opportunity to resolve the dispute and provide room for a discussion of the longer-term issues facing the scheme. That's really a slap on the wrist for USS, I think. Of course, USS will say, well, we couldn't do anything more because the pensions regulator was breathing down our neck. But clearly, the JEP are saying, whether they're saying it to USS or to the pensions regulator, they're saying, really, you should have taken our proposals in JEP 1 more seriously. And I hope you're going to do better this time around. On valuation governance, they say there is a view that the scheme's valuation governance does not work well and is no longer fit for purpose. The panel shares this view. A funny way of putting things. Why not just say, we don't think it's fit for purpose? But anyway, that's clear. They don't think that the valuation governance is fit for purpose. And I guess what they mean by the valuation governance is the entire procedure whereby a valuation methodology is arrived at and then is implemented every 3 years. Essentially, that procedure at the moment is entirely in the hands of USS. They choose the valuation methodology, and they do have quite a lot of leeway within the regulations as to how they do it. And then they produce a consultation document, the so-called TP consultation document. The employers then make their comments. USS then generally ignore the comments of the employers, although sometimes they take them on board, and then they just plough on. So the governance is very much in the hands of USS, with little input from the employers and essentially no input from the members. On test 1, the panel could not identify any circumstances in which it believed that test 1 should be the primary driver of funding and investment strategies. So that's a really damning indictment of test 1. Essentially, what the panel is saying is that this elaborate mechanism which drives a de-risking investment strategy over the next 20 years should be abandoned insofar as it acts as such a driver. On UCU, I don't know, this is blowing our own trumpets, I guess, as the qualitative research amongst members and non-members demonstrates, the information UCU provides is valued and trusted by union and non-union members alike. I think it's fair to say that UCU, through their actuaries, first actuarial, have provided a pretty consistent and reasoned set of approaches to the valuation of USS over the last 6 years. By contrast with which, I have to say that I do find a lot of the material produced by USS very difficult to understand. They constantly change their terminology. They blind you with science by throwing a lot of actuarial jargon at you, and you have to search backwards and forwards across different documents in order to understand even the most elementary concepts which they are using. So here then, so this is the general things that they have to say, but beyond those comments on JET 1 and its failure to be implemented, on valuation governance, on Test 1 and on UCU, they have a specific proposal for how the scheme should be valued in future. And it's called a dual discount rate proposal. And it runs roughly like this. I'll try to explain it as quickly as I can. At the moment, there's a single discount rate which you apply to all the liabilities. But what's proposed in this is that you break down the liabilities and look at the liabilities associated with each particular member of the scheme. And then, depending on whether the person is retired or whether the person has a long period of active life as a scheme member ahead of them, you apply a combination of one or of two discount rates. So the simplest example is member 3. Here's someone who's already retired. Now, the argument goes that for someone who's already retired, you need to have the money which is going to cover their liabilities invested in something like bonds. Let's call it a self-sufficiency portfolio. That means, roughly speaking, a bond-like portfolio. Why? Because you don't want the vagaries of the stock market to cause problems in the payout to that particular person's pension. So imagine that person was all alone with their own singular pension pot. Then by that time, by the time they were retired, they would want to have the money to cover their pension payments invested in something like a self-sufficiency portfolio. However, if you look at someone like member 1, who's at the beginning of their career, the argument would be that it's unnecessary for that person's liabilities to be, the money to cover that person's liabilities to be invested in a self-sufficiency portfolio for, supposing they've got 40 years of active life ahead of them for the next 40 years. For those 40 years, it makes more sense for the money to cover their liabilities to be invested in a return-seeking portfolio, and then once they retire, then it can be transferred to a self-sufficiency portfolio. So that's the basic thinking behind the dual discount rate. And then the actual way that it translates into the valuation methodology is that you say, well, if, as it were, notionally, that's how we would invest each member's money in a return-seeking portfolio for the period while they're employed, and then in a low-risk portfolio, a self-sufficiency portfolio, for the period when they're retired, then let's correspondingly adopt a discount rate which corresponds to this investment strategy. For this for the little pot of money that corresponds to member 3's liabilities, let's discount those liabilities at the so-called post-retirement discount rate, the discount rate that corresponds to a self-sufficiency portfolio. For member 1, and for others, members 1 and members 2, let's calculate the discount rate as a combination of the discount rate that would correspond to the return-seeking portfolio and the discount rate that would correspond to a post-retirement, a low-risk portfolio. So when I say a discount rate corresponding to a portfolio, what I'm assuming in the background here is that throughout, USS will keep to their method of calculating a discount rate, which is to say, here's the portfolio which we expect to have over the future 10, 15, 20, or 50 years. What's the rate of return that we expect to have on that? What's the best estimate of the rate of return? And then let's look at the 67% certain estimate of the rate of return, namely that rate of return which we are 67% certain of gaining at least that much. So because of the 67% rule, you have a connection between, fairly tight connection between the investment strategy, the portfolio that you're planning to invest in, and the discount rate. So here, since notionally you have two different investment strategies for different parts of the fund, depending on which liabilities they're being assigned to cover, corresponding to those two investment strategies, you have two different discount rates, and then you calculate an overall discount rate, what's called a single effective discount rate for the scheme as a whole, which would be the consequence of applying these two discount rates in different proportions for different members across the entire scheme. So, what they did, apart from making this proposal for a dual discount rate, they pointed out that it would have certain advantages. For example, that it would mean that if people stopped joining the scheme and members of the scheme progressively aged and got closer to retirement, then the discount rate would automatically adjust as more and more of the liabilities look like the ones in member 3s. So more and more of the liabilities would be discounted at the post-retirement, the lower post-retirement discount rate. If, by contrast, more and more people started joining the scheme at the junior end, then more and more people would look like member 1, and correspondingly the overall effect would be to increase the discount rate. Generally speaking, the higher the discount rate, the lower the technical provisions that you need to cover the liabilities, and the lower the contributions are going to be. So high discount rate equals good, low discount rate equals bad from the point of view of our contributions. So USS were asked by the JEP panel to model 3 different ways in which the dual discount rate could be applied. And in all 3, they assumed that the discount rate for the post-retirement discount rate, the lower discount rate, should be set at gilts plus 0.75%. So gilts is a bit of a tricky term. It means the yield on treasury bonds. You might say, well, do you mean 30-year treasury bonds or 20-year treasury bonds or 40-year treasury bonds, because they're all different? Well, the answer is that it's a weighted average of those depending on how far ahead the liabilities fall. So anyway, we'll just say gilts. Then they said, well, what about the pre-retirement discount rate? What should we calculate that at? And they took 3 possibilities. One possibility is gilts plus 2.5%, another gilts plus 3%, another gilts plus 3.5%. Obviously, those would represent increasingly return-seeking portfolios for the pre-retirement period, if you are thinking of the discount rates as being tied to particular investment strategies. What they then did was they asked USS to model the consequences of applying the dual discount rate valuation method to the 2018 valuation and see what would come out. And the upshot was that, depending on which one you used, obviously, the future service contributions could come out as low as 23.8%, which is 5% lower than the 28.7% that we have under option 3. Now, this is a table which I did as part of my holiday project, which was to try to investigate the dual discount rate and get it straight in my head, which was published as a USS brief a month or so ago. What I did was look at the key things really are rows 3, 4, and 5 here. I looked at the 2018 valuation, looked at the technical provisions, the value of assets, the difference between those two, which is the deficit or surplus, £3.6 billion, the deficit recovery contributions, which were made part of that valuation, and the contributions adding up in the end to a total of 30.7%, 9.6% members, 21.1% employers, which is where we stand now. And the discount rate that's used in the 2018 valuation is gilts plus 1.33%. That was the one which USS settled on as the limit of what they thought to be the limit of affordability. Now, I could have done extra rows for gilts plus 2.5%, gilts plus 3%, but I just took the most optimistic view here. If we look at gilts plus 3.5%, then what are the consequences for for contributions? It depends, unfortunately, on a certain further assumption which you have to make, which is what is going to be the level of consumer price inflation, CPI, what's going to be the rate of increase, I should say, of the consumer price index over the next 30 or 50 years. And there are two different ways that USS calculate that. One, they calculate it the so-called TP-CPI method, and the other, the SS, social self-sufficiency CPI method. And without going into the technicalities, these lead to different conclusions about what total contributions would be. Total contributions come out as 23.6% under the one and 26.9% under the other. But in both cases, quite substantially less than 30.7%, which we're paying under the 2018 valuation. So what we're saying here is that if you applied the dual discount rate, and if you set the pre-retirement discount rate at gilts plus 3.5%, and if market conditions for the 2020 valuation were identical to the ones for the 2018 valuation, that's a big if, then the upshot would be that total contributions would come down from 30.7% to either 23.6 or 26.9%, depending on what inflation assumption you used. How would that work out in terms of member contributions and employer contributions? Well, it makes a slight difference here whether you take one approach to deficit recovery contributions or another. If you take the view, which I do, which is that deficit recovery contributions should be entirely covered by the employer and shouldn't be a matter for the member, then you get one set of calculations, and let's suppose you say that the remainder of any increase relative to row one, the remainder of any increase relative to row one is to be divided 35-65 between members and employers. Then you get, I think it's the red figures. Whereas if you take the other view, which is that, no, I think it's the blue figures you get that way. And then if you take the other view, which is all increases, regardless of whether they are increase in deficit recovery contribution or whether they are increases in future services contributions, all of them should be divided 35-65 between employer, a member and employer. In that case, you get the other set of figures. So I'm going to refer you to the full discussion in this USS brief for working out, A, whether you think that it would be better for the whole of any increase to be shared 35-65 or only the future services part of an increase to be shared 35-65, and to draw your conclusions about the figures. But I don't think we have to go into that much detail about that. It's fairly clear that you're going to end up with member contributions which are not very far away on any of these four assumptions, not very far away from the 8% that we were at up till a year ago. So in that sense, the dual discount proposal does look quite positive. Are there problems with it? Yes. There are problems. There are problems which the JEP2 already identified, that if it led to increased contributions, then higher earners might leave the scheme, that there might be cliff edges between contribution levels which would leave scheme members worse off. So in other words, there could be points at which, as with what universal credit was meant to eliminate, where a sudden change from one discount rate to another discount rate makes people substantially worse off. And there could be adverse intergenerational impacts. I myself, in that brief, identified what I thought were two problems with it. One is that the discount rates, not only the post-retirement discount rate at gilts plus 0.75%, but also the pre-retirement discount rate appeared to be tethered to the long-dated gilt yield. And gilt yields, well, they haven't been heading in a happy direction, as you can see. The last 5-7 years in the top chart here, they've gone down and down and down. And those last 7 years correspond to just this little bit of the longer term trend, which goes back to 1990, which is also down and down and down. So these are 10-year index-linked gilt yields. These are 30 years. So the actual numbers on the right are different. Generally speaking, the longer the maturity of a gilt, the higher the yield is. So this goes down to minus 2% at the very bottom. This goes down to minus a bit more than 2%. But you can see the general trend has been downwards. Now, if the plan, it's not quite clear what JEP2 are proposing, but if JEP2 are proposing that the pre-retirement discount rate should be set in perpetuity, so to speak, at a certain level above gilts, at, say, 2% or 2.5% or 3% or 3.5%, then given that the long-term trend in gilt yields has been relentlessly downwards over the last, 30 years, it's not irrational to suppose that that trend might continue. So this is a worry that you're going to, if you think of this discount rate as something that you are going to set in stone as part of the valuation methodology over the next several valuations, that you're going to agree in advance that the discount rate, the pre-retirement discount rate is going to be, let's say, gilts plus 3.5%, then you're committing yourself to, in effect, the likelihood of ever decreasing discount rates, and we know where that leads. Of course, the assumption I'm making is that other forms of investment are not going to take the same ever lower trend. You know that Marx argued that there's a falling rate of profit, which means that everything, no matter where you invest it, the investments gradually produce lower and lower yields. But it doesn't seem, in fact, to be the case. If you look at the yields, the returns on equities or the returns on private capital over the last 30 years, they haven't taken that same relentless downward trend. So if that's what the J and JEP are doing, then it seems a mistake. The other thing that I pointed to in my piece is that there's a potential in the dual discount rate proposal for a negative feedback loop, which could go like this. Supposing for some reason the contribution rate at the next valuation goes up, that could lead to fewer new people joining the scheme at the junior end.
Need to hear that, I know me too.
And if the consequence of fewer people joining at the junior end would be that the whole scheme would tip more towards the post-retirement rate and away from the pre-retirement rate, and the discount rate would correspondingly, overall single effective discount rate would correspondingly go down, which would mean at the next valuation, contributions would be higher yet. And then you could have a further effect of junior members choosing not to join the scheme. So you could get a negative feedback loop, which would eventually stifle the scheme altogether through, over a number of years, through this process. Corresponding to the critique, the criticisms which I made of the dual discount rate proposal, I made a couple of suggestions for how it could be improved. With regard to the pre-retirement rate, I suggested that it could be instead set not by the gilt yield, but by a transparent version of their current way of setting the discount rate, which, as I said, is a 67% certain expected rate of return, using what they call a fundamental building blocks approach. What they do is they look at all the different assets which they hold or plan to hold over the next 5, 10, 15 years. They work out what the 67% certain rate of return on each asset is, and then they aggregate those. So if you had a completely transparent version of that, which they don't have at the moment, in which the data and the calculation method were made public so that in principle anyone could check the calculations that were being made, then that would be, to my mind, a better way of setting the pre-retirement discount rate. Now, it may be that that's what JEP2 were saying all along. They weren't very clear. It's possible that's what they had in mind, and when they gave us these measures of the pre-retirement discount rate being set at gilts plus 3%, gilts plus 3.5%, that was meant to be just an phenomenal figure. It was just meant to be, here is how, supposing that we invested in such a portfolio that the fundamental building blocks approach produced a discount rate which was gilts plus 3.5%. So it could have been just intended as a measure rather than as defining what the pre-retirement discount rate was going to be. In that case, what I'm proposing is just clarifying what the JEP2 were trying to say all along. The other modification which I proposed is a 5-year rule for the use of post-retirement, for use of the post-retirement rate. And the thought here goes like this. Supposing that we just have one single person in the entire scheme, and supposing that they are retired. Is it really sensible for that person's pension pot to be entirely invested in low-risk assets? Supposing they're retired, the average retirement is 18 years. That's the figure that was given by the JEP. Supposing I've only just retired, it could well be the case that the money which I'm going to need for my pension payments over the next 5 years, it would be good if that money were invested in low-risk assets, such that I could be absolutely certain of the return coming back from those assets. But looking ahead 10 or 15 years, it seems a bit absurd to keep all of that money in these low-return, low-risk assets. Wouldn't it be more sensible for that money which I'm not going to need for another 5 years to be in return-seeking assets? So it could be a 5-year rule, it could be an 8-year rule, it could be a 10-year rule. I'm not particularly concerned about the numbers, but the principle of this is that at any given time, only that part of the fund which is associated with liabilities which will fall due within the following 5 years would be invested in a self-sufficiency portfolio, while the rest would remain in a return-seeking portfolio. So the upshot would be, it's a bit difficult to show you the calculations, the upshot would be that a higher proportion of the fund would be invested in a return-seeking portfolio in that notional investment strategy to which the discount rate calculation corresponds, and consequently the discount rate would be higher overall, the single effective discount rate would be higher overall. These two proposals do hinge on a kind of crucial point with regard to the dual discount rate proposal, which is that, as far as I can see, this dual discount rate proposal only makes any kind of intellectual sense if it's tied to a corresponding dual investment strategy. One investment strategy for those funds which are to cover the liabilities which are being valued at the post-retirement discount rate, and another strategy for the remainder of the fund. If you dissociate the discount rate proposal from the investment strategy, then you lose this 67% connection, you lose your fundamental building blocks approach, and it begins to look a little bit arbitrary why you should choose that particular discount rate proposal. So I have assumed that the two go hand in hand. There's a dual investment strategy and a dual discount rate. Okay, JEP. Let me just see what I'm doing for time. Already it's running out. Okay, well, I'll run fairly fast through some of these other things. JEP2, there was a roadmap. There have been 5 tripartite talks between USS, UCU, and USS, UCU, and UK. They began by agreeing a scheme, well, they tried to agree a scheme purpose statement and shared valuation principles, but so far there's been no agreement on a shared scheme purpose. I must say that these recommended shared scheme statements of purpose don't look so far apart from each other, but the fact remains that they couldn't agree a form of wording. They have had these 5 talks. They have established now a valuation discussion forum, and they're planning to establish a strategic discussion forum as well. The JEP has made a number of proposals. The dual discount rate proposal is one of them. It's not quite clear whether the intention is to tie it to the corresponding investment strategy. As I say, I can't see any other rational way of doing things. But they've also proposed pretty radical ideas to replace the JNC, or to at least make it more independent, and to remove the chair's casting vote. They've also suggested replacing UUK, which after all began as a lobbying group. It's meant to be a lobbying group for universities and has turned into this negotiator for pensions issues, and instead to have a single body which would negotiate pay and pensions simultaneously. It's obviously very complicated for us at Sussex, not so for IDS, but it's very complicated that we're in a dispute, a simultaneous dispute over pay and conditions on the one hand and pensions on the other, but with 2 different employer bodies to negotiate with, UCU in the one case and UUK in the other. They've made proposals about ensuring that the scheme remains open on consulting members and on addressing the relatively high 15% opt-out rate that the scheme suffers from at the moment. 15% of people who could be in USS are not. These are some points about the general failures of governance within the USS scheme. I think I will only mention the one sentence from the FT editorial board on the 29th of November. An independent inquiry should scrutinise the handling of the USS valuation by all key players, including the pensions regulator. So there's a suggestion here that everyone's screwed up in some way. There is the further complications of the Jane Hutton affair, which I won't go into in any detail, except to say that she was a member of the Board of Trustees who, to my mind, engaged in too much digging and attempting to get too much information. And in the end, the upshot was that she was dismissed, although USS argued stoutly that this was nothing to do with her demands for information from USS. At the moment, the whole thing is under legal wraps and not much more that can be said about it. In the meantime, there's been a new trustee chair appointed starting from August 2020 to replace David Eastwood, Kate Barker. And there's been, going back to the top of this slide, there is consultation happening with the employers on JEP2. IDS staff, congratulations, have been consulted and the response will be shared. A model, I think, on the part of IDS as director. Sussex staff have not yet been consulted, and there's been no promise to share the institutional response. So we have written, at Sussex UCU, have written just today to the council and to the Vice-Chancellor to request that Sussex should follow IDS's model here. What has been achieved? What has Action achieved? We've had these 2 longest periods of strikes in the history of the union in the spring of 2018 and then the end of 2019. We've had, I think, not coincidentally, I mean, the JEP was set up as a result of the first strike period. We've had 2 excellent JEP reports. I think on the whole they are very good. There's been an increase in national support for our position, a lot of media coverage. We've had these 5 tripartite talks, which would never have happened, I'm sure, had there not been the JEP and the pressure under which all parties were placed by the threat of further strikes. We've had the valuation methodology and the strategic discussion forums established. There is an ongoing valuation methodology review, and there is already a JNC stochastic modelling group, which the TP are attending. So a lot is happening with regard to the way in which the valuation of the USS scheme is being done, which would have been unthinkable a couple of years ago, in which TPR are being brought into the process and UUK are being brought into the process, and importantly, we, UCU, are being brought into the process as well. And I'm sure that none of this would have happened without the strike action that we've taken. UUK are consulting employers on JEP2, but they're also consulting employers on whether to make an immediate offer on the dispute that we're in. The immediate cause of the dispute on USS is the demand on the part of UCU that contributions should not rise above 8% or should revert to 8% until we have a satisfactory valuation. As you know, they're 9.6%. UUK temporarily offered 9.1%. That was refused by UCU. UUK have now launched a very quick consultation with all the employers asking whether they are willing for UUK to make a better offer. We have written to Sussex UCU, have written to Sussex Council, urging Sussex Council to respond to that consultation, as you would expect we would urge them to, by saying, yes, you should make a better offer. But we think that there are arguments to be made for making a better offer, ideally 8%, but I'm sure that UCU would consider something at least close to 8%. There are arguments for making a better offer, quite independently of the argument from justice, which is that we shouldn't have to pay more until there's a satisfactory valuation. Arguments on the basis of the damage which further strikes will do to the sector. What's happening now? So this is where I'm going to wind up. We believe that employers should cover the cost of the flawed valuation methodology. There's been a reballot. There are now 74 institutions in one dispute or the other, 52 in the pensions dispute. UUK, we believe, did not strongly call enough for the JEP to be implemented in 2019. And we believe that employers should publicly call for JEP to be implemented as a package. Is the only way to push for this with pressure of action? Good question, but it's the only thing that's worked so far. Will an offer be made in time? Well, on the USS side, I think it's quite possible that an offer will be made in time. Everything depends on the present consultation. I understand that Council at Sussex will be meeting in a few days and will make a decision as to whether to say yes or no to the proposal for making an improved offer. No doubt that's happening to other universities around the country. There must be some universities which are already pressing for UUK to make an improved offer. Otherwise, UUK would not have launched this consultation. Will an offer be put to members? Well, I think if an improved offer was put to members, if, for example, just plucking a figure out of the blue, if UUK were to offer 8.8%, to say we will cover all pension contributions above 8.8%, I think it would be almost impossible for HEC not to put that offer to members. And I think it's very likely that members would accept it. It's not what we think is just, but at least it would represent an improvement of the 9.6%, and in conjunction with the fact that so much progress seems to be being made on our participation in a more sane 2020 valuation, I think that could be, I'm not making a recommendation here, I'm not in a position to, but I think that could be grounds for suspending the action. Obviously, we in Sussex are still in the other dispute, but that's with regard to IDS. Will there be conditions? Well, that's a good question. UUK tried to attach conditions. At one point, they made a 9.1% offer, but they attached some silly conditions to it, which was one of the reasons why it was rejected. Will there be last-minute changes? Yeah, this is and then the question of the linking with the UCUA dispute. If Sussex is to suspend action, then there needs to be something on both fronts, because even if we are no longer in dispute on one, then we're still in dispute on the other. There might be a mechanism whereby the strikes on the second dispute could be postponed if the first dispute were resolved. I'm not going to go into this. The slides will be available. I'm not going to go into this either, except to say that we have declared a climate emergency. Sussex has fully divested from fossil fuels, but USS still have £1.3 billion invested in fossil fuels. And it's regrettable that Sussex didn't respond to USS new statement of investment principles consultation, which could have been an opportunity for USS to make a change with regard to its policies on fossil fuel investment. That's it, yes.